Your 20s are supposed to be the best years of your life. That's what everyone says. So why do they feel like the most confusing, uncertain, and sometimes humiliating decade you've ever lived through? Here's the truth nobody puts on a graduation card. That feeling of falling behind, of not having it figured out, of watching everyone else seemingly get it right while you stumble through, that's not a sign something is wrong with you. It's a sign something is working exactly as it should. Your 20s are designed to feel like failure, and understanding why that's true will completely change how you experience them. Because here's what's actually happening. You're not failing, you're calibrating. And the difference between those two things is everything. Chapter 1, The Gap Nobody Talks About. There's a phenomenon psychologists call the expectation gap. It's the space between where you thought you'd be and where you actually are. And in your 20s, that gap is almost always enormous. You grew up watching a particular story: graduate, get the job, find the relationship, build the life, each milestone arriving on schedule like trains at a station. But when you actually step into your 20s, the timetable disappears. The trains run late. Some don't come at all. And nobody tells you this is completely normal. Here's what most people do with that gap. They assume it means they're behind. They look at the distance between expectation and reality and call it failure. But that interpretation is wrong. The gap isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of your awareness. You're old enough to have ambitions and young enough that you haven't had time to achieve them yet. That tension is supposed to exist. It means you care about your life. It means your standards are high. Those are not character flaws. The most dangerous people in their 20s aren't those who feel the gap. They're those who don't. The ones who've settled into a comfortable numbness, checked a few boxes and decided that's enough. They feel no gap because they've stopped wanting more. Your discomfort is data. It's your internal compass telling you there's more to find. The question isn't how to eliminate the feeling, it's how to use it. Chapter 2, The Comparison Trap. Here's something counterintuitive. Social media didn't create the comparison problem. It just gave it a megaphone. Human beings have always measured themselves against those around them. It's evolutionary software, not a personal weakness. When our ancestors lived in small tribes, social standing determined survival. Your brain still runs that ancient code. It's constantly scanning the environment, measuring, calibrating, asking, am I keeping up? But here's the catch. That system was designed for a tribe of 150 people. People you actually knew. People whose private struggles were as visible as their public wins. Today, that same system is running against an audience of millions. Carefully curated highlight reels, filtered moments, strategic announcements. You're comparing your full unedited experience to everyone else's greatest hits and then wondering why you feel behind. Think about the last time someone posted about their job offer, their engagement, their apartment, their startup funding. What you saw was the result. What you didn't see was the 47 rejections, the relationship that almost ended, the 3 failed apartments before that one, the pitch deck they rewrote 11 times. You're not losing a race. You're watching a race from the outside and thinking it looks easier than it actually is. The fix isn't to stop paying attention, it's to widen your frame. Start noticing what doesn't get posted. The Sunday anxiety, the imposter syndrome in a new role, the relationship maintenance nobody photographs. When you see the full picture, the comparison loses its teeth. And here's what actually happens when you stop comparing timelines. You get your own back. The mental energy you were spending measuring yourself against others returns to building something real. That's not a small thing, that's everything. Chapter 3, Identity is a Process, Not a Discovery. Most people walk into their 20s expecting to find themselves, as if identity is something buried somewhere waiting to be uncovered, a fixed thing, a final answer. Dig long enough and you'll hit it. That's not how identity works. Identity isn't something you find, it's something you construct, continuously, through experience, failure, exposure, and revision. There is no moment where you arrive at who you are. There's only the ongoing process of becoming. This is actually good news, because it means your confusion isn't a failure to find the answer. It's the answer. You're in the middle of building something that takes a decade to build. Think about it this way. At 22, you're working with limited data. You've experienced a narrow range of environments, relationships, careers, and challenges. Your self concept at that age is built on a small sample size. Of course, it doesn't feel fully formed. It isn't. Not yet. Every experience in your 20s is data collection. That job that wasn't right for you, it told you something essential about what actually matters to you in a workplace. That relationship that didn't work, it showed you what you can and can't compromise on. That city you moved to, it revealed which parts of your identity travel with you and which parts were just products of your environment. None of those experiences are failures. They're research. And the person who runs more experiments ends up with better data, a richer, more precise understanding of who they actually are and what they actually want. The ones who play it safe, who stay in the known, who choose comfort over discovery. They arrive at 35 with a stable life built around an identity they chose at 22. And then they spend the rest of their lives wondering whether they chose correctly. Run the experiments, gather the data, trust the process. Chapter 4. The Myth of Linear Progress. Here's a massive misconception your 20s will destroy if you let it. The idea that progress is supposed to be linear. We're trained to think development looks like a straight line going up. More experience equals more clarity, equals more success, equals more happiness. Each year better than the last. Each chapter cleaner than the previous one. But real development doesn't look like that. It looks like a spiral. You revisit the same themes: confidence, direction, relationships, identity, but each time from a higher vantage point. What looks like going in circles is actually going deeper. Those moments where you feel like you've regressed, where you're back at square one, uncertain again after a period of clarity, that's not regression. That's integration. You've moved to a new level of the same problem and your brain is recalibrating. Think about how you felt about money at 22 versus 26, about relationships at 23 versus 28, about career at 24 versus 29. The same questions, but your relationship to them has fundamentally shifted. You bring more self-knowledge, more nuance, more hard-won perspective. That's not going in circles. That's building something. The problem is that spiral progress doesn't feel like progress from the inside. It feels like you keep ending up in the same place. But you're not the same person who was there last time. And that changes everything. Stop measuring your 20s against a straight line. Measure them against who you were 2 years ago, 3 years ago. That's the only comparison that tells you something true. Chapter 5. What Failure Actually Builds. Here's something most people won't say out loud. You need to fail in your 20s, not symbolically, actually, concretely, in ways that sting. Not because suffering is virtuous, but because failure in your 20s is the least expensive tuition you will ever pay. A failed startup at 25 costs you time and energy. The same lesson at 45 costs you your savings, your family's stability, and a decade of compounding opportunity. The risk-reward calculation in your 20s is fundamentally different from every other decade. The stakes are lower, the recovery window is longer, the lessons are deeper, and here's what failure actually builds that success can't. Failure builds your relationship with uncertainty. Every time something doesn't work, and you survive it, your nervous system updates its threat assessment. The thing you were afraid of happened, and you're still here. That update is permanent. It doesn't reset. The people who've never failed in their 20s often have the most fragile relationship with risk because they've never tested the floor. They don't actually know how low they can go and still get back up, so they avoid anything that might bring them close to finding out. Conversely, the people who failed early and recovered move through the world differently. They've stress-tested themselves. They know what they're made of. Not because someone told them they were resilient, but because they proved it to themselves under actual conditions. That's not something a certificate can give you. It's not something a seminar can simulate. You earn it by going through it. Chapter 6. The Pressure That Isn't Yours. Take a moment and ask yourself honestly, how much of the pressure you feel right now actually belongs to you? Not borrowed from your parents' expectations, not inherited from your culture's timeline, not absorbed from watching peers announce achievements online. How much of it is genuinely yours? Most people in their 20s are carrying pressure that was never theirs to carry, scripts written by other people for other lives, timelines designed for different decades, definitions of success that never match their actual values. Social timelines are even worse. The idea that certain things should happen by certain ages isn't wisdom. It's a social construct that changes by culture, class, and decade. Graduate by 22, stable career by 25, relationship by 27, house by 30. That schedule was invented. It has no authority over your actual life. The problem is that when you inherit someone else's timeline and fail to meet it, you experience their failure, not yours. You're being graded on a test you never agreed to take. The most important work of your 20s is figuring out which pressures you've chosen and which ones were quietly installed without your consent. Because once you can see the difference, you can start building a life around your own criteria. And that changes the entire definition of what success and failure actually mean. Chapter 7. The Compound Effect of Small Decisions. Here's the most underrated truth about your 20s. The big decisions matter far less than you think. The small ones matter far more. Career choice, city, partner, these feel like the hinge points, and they do matter, but they are not where your life is actually being built. Your life is being built in the decisions you make every single day that feel too small to count. Whether you read or scroll, whether you sleep or stay up, whether you call or don't, whether you show up or hedge, whether you start or wait until you're ready, these micro decisions don't feel significant. That's the trap. Each one individually is nearly weightless, but they compound with mathematical precision. Over years, those small daily choices create the person you become. And that person is the one who makes the big decisions later. This is why your 20s aren't really about getting the big things right. They're about building the baseline, the habits, the defaults, the automatic responses that will run quietly in the background of every future decade. The person who builds a reading habit at 24 has read hundreds of books by 40. The person who starts saving $100 a month at 23 has a fundamentally different financial baseline at 35. The person who learns to have difficult conversations early develops relationships at 30 that most people won't experience at 50. None of those outcomes came from one big decision. They came from hundreds of small decisions that felt insignificant in the moment. Your 20s aren't about getting it all figured out. They're about building the daily architecture that determines who you become when the bigger moments finally arrive. Chapter 8. Permission to be unfinished. One of the most quietly damaging beliefs in your 20s is the idea that you're supposed to arrive somewhere, that there's a point at which the uncertainty ends, the direction becomes clear, and the discomfort resolves. That if you're still searching at 27 or 29 or 31, something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. The people who seem most certain in their 20s are often the least self-aware. Certainty at 24 is usually just a confident-sounding story built on insufficient data. The people who seem most lost are often the most honest about the complexity of what they are navigating. Give yourself permission to be unfinished, not as a consolation prize, not as a temporary condition you'll graduate out of once you get your act together, as a legitimate state of being that is completely appropriate for where you are. You don't demand that a tree look like a forest. You don't call a foundation incomplete because the house isn't built yet. The work being unseen isn't the same as the work not happening. In your 20s, most of the important work is invisible. It's happening in the conversations you're having, the experiences you're collecting, the patterns you're noticing, the preferences you're clarifying. You won't be able to see what it's building until much later. That's the nature of foundations. And here's what happens when you finally grant yourself that permission. The energy you were spending on self-judgment becomes available for something else. For actually living the decade instead of anxiously managing appearances. For taking risks instead of protecting a version of yourself that isn't even fully formed yet. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are exactly as unfinished as you're supposed to be at this stage. And that's not a problem to solve. It's a condition to inhabit with curiosity instead of shame. Chapter 9. That long game. Here's the final shift, and it's the most important one. Your 20s aren't the performance, they're the rehearsal. Everything you're building right now, the habits, the self-knowledge, the resilience, the relationships, None of it is for your 20s, it's for every decade that comes after. The returns on your 20s don't arrive in your 20s. They arrive at 35, 40, 50, in compounding waves you can't yet see from where you're standing. This is why playing the long game in your 20s is such a radical act. The culture is screaming at you to optimize for now, for visible results, for immediate payoff, for the post that demonstrates you've arrived. But the people who look back at their 20s with the most satisfaction aren't those who won the decade. They're those who used it as a foundation. Think about the people you admire most, the ones who seem genuinely grounded, fulfilled, clear-headed at 40 or 50. Almost without exception, they'll point to something they built quietly in their 20s. A skill, a habit, a relationship, a willingness to be uncomfortable, something that didn't look impressive at the time but compounded into something essential. That's what's available to you right now. Not the result, the foundation. Your 20s feeling like failure might be the best evidence that you're taking them seriously, that you're measuring yourself against something real, that you haven't made peace with mediocrity or settled for the path of least resistance. The discomfort is the curriculum. The confusion is the work. The feeling of not having it figured out is proof that you're engaged with a life that actually means something to you. Start small. Pick one thing from what you've heard today. Test it. Refine it. Make it yours. The best time to start building the life you actually want isn't someday. It's today.